Captain Richard Fleming sits alone in the ready room at Midway, 5 hours before dawn. Around him, every pilot knows they are outnumbered. They know the Japanese carrier force is closing, and they know the odds of coming back from a dive bombing run against a fleet like that are less than even. Fleming flips through a worn manual on carrier attack profiles, scribbling notes in the margin while others try to sleep. His squadron mates call him Bookworm. Some say it with affection, others with impatience. But in a few hours, that quiet obsession with detail will become the difference between chaos and precision. June 1942. The Central Pacific is no longer an ocean. It is a chessboard, and every square matters. The Japanese combined fleet is steaming toward Midway Atoll, intent on drawing out what remains of the American carrier force and destroying it. If Midway falls, Hawaii becomes vulnerable. If Hawaii wavers, the entire Pacific strategy collapses. The United States Navy and Marine Corps know this. So does every man stationed on that narrow strip of coral and sand. The air is thick with aviation, fuel, and salt. Mechanics work under floodlights, patching bullet holes in Dauntless dive bombers and Vindicator scout bombers that have seen better days. Engines cough to life in the dark, then settle into an uneven idle. Ground crews move quietly, checking ordnance loads, tightening cowling panels, double-checking hydraulic lines. There is no bravado here, only preparation. Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, SB2U is a composite unit. Some of its pilots are seasoned, most are not. They fly a mix of SBD Dauntlesses and older SB2U Vindicators, aircraft that were considered second line even before the war began. The Vindicator in particular is slow, underpowered, and unforgiving in a dive. The men call it the wind indicator. Some call it worse. But it is what they have, and they will fly it into the teeth of the most powerful naval force afloat. Captain Richard Fleming is 24 years old. He grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, far from the sea. He was a good student, quiet, methodical. He joined the Marine Corps not out of romanticism, but out of a sense that the world was tilting toward something dark and unavoidable. He completed flight training in Pensacola, where instructors noted his precision and his tendency to stay late in the ready room, studying attack diagrams and aircraft performance charts. He did not drink much. He did not chase the usual distractions. He read. By the time he reached the Pacific, Fleming had absorbed every scrap of doctrine he could find on dive bombing, carrier tactics, and target recognition. He knew the silhouette of every Japanese ship class. He knew the altitude bands where anti-aircraft fire was most effective. He knew the physics of a bombing dive, how airspeed, angle, and release altitude intersected to determine accuracy. His crewmates respected him, but some found him hard to relax around. He did not tell jokes. He did not boast, he simply prepared. Now in the hours before the battle, Fleming reviews his notes one more time. The plan is straightforward. Search planes will locate the Japanese fleet. Strike groups will launch in waves. Dive bombers will target the carriers. Torpedo planes will go low. Fighters will try to cover both. It is a plan built on hope and arithmetic, and everyone knows it. The Japanese have more planes, more experience, and more firepower. The Americans have courage and geography. Midway is their base. They cannot retreat from it. Fleming folds the manual and tucks it into his flight bag. Around him, other pilots stir. Someone makes coffee on a battered hot plate. Another checks his sidearm, then checks it again. No one talks much. There is nothing left to say. Outside, the first light is still an hour away, but the horizon is already beginning to pale. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of sight, the Japanese fleet is turning into the wind to launch its own strike. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Richard Eugene Fleming was born in 1917 in a Minnesota winter that felt like it would never end. His father worked in insurance. His mother taught school. The family was stable, religious, and quiet. Richard was the kind of boy who finished his homework early and then read ahead. He liked maps. He liked history. He liked understanding how things worked. His teachers noted that he asked good questions, the kind that showed he had already thought through the obvious answers. In high school, he played football, but he was not a star. He was dependable. He showed up to practice. He learned the playbook. Coaches liked him because he did not need to be told twice. His classmates liked him because he did not show off. He was simply present, steady, and oddly unshakable. When the yearbook staff asked him what he wanted to do after graduation, he said he was thinking about the military. No one was surprised. He enrolled at the University of Minnesota, but the pull of service was stronger than the pull of a degree. In 1939, as Europe collapsed into war, Fleming left school and joined the United States Marine Corps. He did not announce it dramatically. He simply made the decision and followed through. His family supported him. His friends thought he was brave. Fleming thought he was being practical. The world was changing and he wanted to be useful. Flight training suited him. The discipline, the technical complexity, the need for precision under pressure, it all aligned with the way his mind worked. He learned to fly the N-3N biplane trainer, then moved on to more advanced aircraft. He studied navigation, meteorology, and gunnery. He memorized aircraft performance data. He practiced dive bombing runs until the angle and the airspeed and the release point became instinctive. Instructors noted that he was not a natural stick-and-rudder pilot in the way some men were. He did not have the flair, but he had something better: consistency. He made fewer mistakes. He learned faster, and he never stopped studying. By the time he earned his wings, Fleming had absorbed the Marine Corps ethos completely. The Marines did not have the largest air arm. They did not have the newest planes. But they had a reputation for doing more with less, for closing with the enemy, for holding ground no one else wanted. Fleming understood that. He did not need glory, he needed purpose. And in the Pacific, purpose was abundant. He joined VMSB 241 in early 1942, just as the unit was forming up for deployment. The squadron was a mix of old hands and new pilots, flying a mix of old planes and slightly newer ones. The SBD Dauntless was a solid aircraft, sturdy, reliable, capable of taking punishment. The SB2U Vindicator was not. It was slower, less maneuverable, and more vulnerable to enemy fighters. But it could carry a bomb, and that was what mattered. Fleming flew both. He studied both. He knew the Vindicator's weaknesses intimately. He knew it could not outrun a Zero. He knew it could not outturn one either. He knew that if he ended up in a dogfight, he was dead, so he made sure he understood exactly how to avoid that situation. He studied Japanese fighter tactics. He studied their attack patterns. He learned where they liked to position themselves during a strike and how they coordinated their passes. He read intelligence reports. He talked to pilots who had survived combat. He built a mental model of the enemy, not out of fear, but out of respect for the problem they represented. His squadron mates noticed. Some admired it. Others found it excessive. One pilot joked that Fleming probably dreamed in aircraft silhouettes. Another said he would rather have Fleming on his wing than any hotshot in the squadron. Fleming did not respond to either comment. He just kept reading. When VMSB 241 deployed to Midway in May 1942, the strategic situation was clear. The Japanese were coming. The question was when and in what strength. The Marines on Midway had no illusions. They were the tripwire. If the Japanese wanted the atoll, they would have to come through them first. And the first line of defense would be the aircraft, patrol planes, fighters, and the fragile, unglamorous dive bombers of VMSB 241. Fleming spent his off hours walking the airstrip, studying the terrain, noting landmarks that could serve as navigation references. He memorized the compass headings to the most likely approach vectors. He sketched out attack profiles in a notebook, calculating fuel consumption and time on target windows. He did not talk about it much. He simply did the work. And when the word came down that Japanese carriers had been spotted northwest of Midway, he was ready. The problem facing American forces at Midway was not a lack of courage. It was a lack of time, experience, and margin for error. The Japanese Navy had been at war since 1937. Its pilots had trained over China, honed their skills over the Philippines, and perfected their tactics in the crucible of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that could outturn and outclimb almost anything the Americans had. They operated from 6 fleet carriers, each one a floating fortress of aviation excellence, and they were very, very good. The Americans, by contrast, were improvising. The Navy had lost significant carrier strength at Pearl Harbor. The remaining flat tops were patched, repaired, and stretched to the breaking point. The Marines on Midway flew obsolete aircraft with inexperienced pilots. The doctrine was sound in theory, but theory and practice were not the same thing. No one had fought a carrier battle like this before. No one knew for certain what would work. Dive bombing was supposed to be the answer. The idea was elegant. Approach at high altitude, roll into a steep dive, release the bomb at low altitude for maximum accuracy, then pull out and escape at speed. The SBD Dauntless was built for this. It had dive brakes, a robust airframe, and enough speed in the dive to make it a difficult target. The SB2U Vindicator was not built for it. It was older, slower, and structurally weaker. Pulling out of a high-speed dive stressed the airframe. Pulling out under combat conditions, with enemy fighters closing in, was a nightmare. The tactical problem was compounded by Japanese defensive doctrine. Carrier groups traveled with layered fighter patrols. Zeros would be stacked at multiple altitudes, waiting for attackers. Anti-aircraft fire from the escorts would fill the sky with bursts of steel. Any dive bomber that survived the fighters would have to fly through that curtain of fire, hold its dive until the last possible second, and then pull out at wave-top height while enemy fighters chased it down. It was not a mission. It was a gauntlet. Fleming understood this better than most. He had studied the after-action reports from Coral Sea, where American dive bombers had attacked Japanese carriers for the first time. He knew that the pilots who survived were the ones who stayed disciplined, who did not release early, who trusted their training and their aircraft. He also knew that the pilots who died were often the ones who hesitated, who pulled out too soon, or who lost situational awareness in the chaos of combat. The margin between life and death was razor-thin, and it hinged on preparation. But preparation only went so far. The squadron had limited combat experience. The newer pilots had never seen a Japanese carrier. They had never been shot at by a Zero. They had never felt the airframe shudder as anti-aircraft shells burst close enough to rattle their teeth. Training could simulate some of that. It could not simulate all of it. And when the moment came, there would be no second chances. Major Lofton Henderson commanded VMSB 241. He was an experienced officer, calm and professional. He knew the odds, he knew his pilots, and he knew that the Japanese would not give them any room for mistakes. The squadron's orders were clear: locate the enemy carriers, attack, and inflict maximum damage. Secondary objectives did not exist. This was not a reconnaissance mission. This was not a raid. This was a knife fight, and the only thing that mattered was sinking carriers. Fleming absorbed all of this without visible reaction. He did not argue with the plan. He did not question the orders. But he did make his own calculations. He knew the Vindicator could not keep up with the faster Dauntlesses. He knew that if the squadron split up, the slower aircraft would be isolated. He knew that isolation meant death. So he made a mental note: stay tight, stay coordinated, and do not let the formation fragment. If they went in together, they had a chance. If they scattered, they were done. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the word came. Japanese carriers spotted. Bearing, range, and speed provided. Launch all available aircraft. Henderson gathered his pilots. He did not give a speech. He simply reviewed the plan, confirmed the navigation, and told them to make every bomb count. Fleming checked his gear one last time. He climbed into the cockpit of his SB2U Vindicator, buckled in, and started the engine. The right cyclone coughed, caught, and settled into a rough idle. The smell of exhaust and oil filled the cockpit. The stick felt solid in his hand. The throttle was smooth. Everything was as ready as it would ever be. The squadron took off in sections, climbing northwest toward the contact point. Below them, the ocean was a flat, glittering expanse. Above them, the sky was empty and blue. Around them, nothing but the sound of engines and the faint crackle of radio static. They flew in formation, holding altitude, conserving fuel. Fleming scanned the horizon constantly, checking for enemy fighters, checking for the other aircraft in his flight, checking the compass and the clock. Time and distance. Always time and distance. Then ahead, the first dark smudges appeared on the horizon. Ships, lots of them. And in the center, the unmistakable shape of an aircraft carrier, her deck busy with planes. Fleming felt his pulse steady. This was it. This was the moment. Everything he had studied, everything he had prepared for came down to the next 20 minutes. He checked his bomb release mechanism. He adjusted his goggles. He took a breath. And then Major Henderson rolled into his dive and the squadron followed. The Japanese fleet spread below them like a diagram from a textbook. Carriers in the center, destroyers and cruisers in a protective ring, wakes cutting white lines through blue water. And already the sky was beginning to fill with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying into the most concentrated air defense network in the Pacific. But they were committed now. There was no turning back. Henderson led the first section down. The Dauntlesses rolled into steep dives, their dive brakes deploying with a distinctive howl. Fleming watched them go, then rolled his own Vindicator into the attack. The older aircraft shuddered as it nosed over. The airspeed climbed. The altimeter unwound. The carrier grew larger in his windscreen, resolving from a silhouette into a ship, into a deck, into individual aircraft parked near the island. He could see men running. He could see gun muzzles tracking upward. He could see the black bursts of flak blooming all around him. The Vindicator was not built for this kind of dive. The airframe groaned. The controls stiffened. Fleming held the stick with both hands, fighting to keep the nose pointed at the target. The bomb release point was calculated based on altitude, airspeed, and angle. Released too early and the bomb would miss. Released too late and he would not have enough altitude to pull out. He had practiced this 100 times. But practice was not the same as threading through a curtain of exploding steel, while a carrier's guns tried to kill him. He held the dive. The altimeter spun. 3,000 feet. 2,000. The carrier filled his vision. He could see the red circle on the deck. He could see the shadows of the gun crews. He could see everything. And then at the exact moment his training told him to, he pulled the release lever. The aircraft lurched upward as the bomb dropped away. Fleming hauled back on the stick, pulling out of the dive with every ounce of strength he had. The Vindicator groaned, shuddered, and leveled off just above the waves. Behind him, the bomb fell toward the carrier. He did not see where it hit. He was already turning, already accelerating, already scanning for enemy fighters. Zeros appeared almost immediately. They came in pairs, slashing down from altitude, their machine guns stitching lines of tracer across the sky. Fleming jinked left, then right, keeping the aircraft low and fast. The Vindicator could not dogfight, but it could hug the water, and at low altitude, a diving Zero had less time to line up a shot. Fleming used every trick he knew. He varied his speed. He skidded left and right, disrupting the enemy's firing solution. He watched the water, watched the sky, and kept moving. 1-0 made a high side pass, tracers snapping past Fleming's canopy. He shoved the stick forward, dropping even lower until the propeller was almost touching the wave tops. The Zero overshot, unable to follow. Fleming pulled up slightly, regained speed, and kept running. Another Zero appeared, this time from behind. Fleming waited until the last second, then broke hard right. The Zero followed, but the angle was wrong. The burst went wide. Fleming leveled out again, still heading away from the fleet, still alive. Behind him, the squadron was scattered. Some aircraft were climbing, trying to gain altitude. Others were skimming the waves like Fleming, trying to survive. Radio chatter was fragmented and tense. Henderson's voice came through once, calm and steady, calling for a regroup. Then silence. Fleming did not know if the Major had been hit or if the radio had simply failed. He kept flying, he kept scanning, he kept moving. Minutes passed. The Zeros began to break off, either out of ammunition or recalled to defend the carriers. Fleming checked his fuel. He checked his gauges. Everything was still functioning. He was still alive. He turned southeast, back toward Midway, and began the long flight home. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by exhaustion and clarity. He had done his job. He had made his attack. Whether the bomb had hit or not, he did not know. But he had stayed disciplined, stayed focused, and stayed alive. That was the first part. The second part was doing it again. When Fleming landed back at Midway, the scene was chaos. Aircraft were scattered across the runway, some damaged, some missing. Ground crews were working frantically to rearm and refuel the survivors. Pilots climbed out of cockpits, pale and shaking, gulping water and trying to process what they had just seen. Fleming taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine, and climbed out. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands were still trembling, but he was alive, and his aircraft was intact. Major Henderson did not return. Neither did several others. The squadron had taken heavy losses, and the battle was not over. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese carriers were still operational. Another strike would be needed. Fleming sat down in the shade of a wing, pulled out his notebook, and started writing. He noted the altitude at which the flak had been heaviest. He noted the Zero tactics. He noted the timing of his dive, the pull-out altitude, and the performance of his aircraft. He was already thinking about the next mission, because he knew there would be one. Later that afternoon, word came down. A second strike was being organized, volunteers only. Fleming did not hesitate. He walked to the operations tent, reported in, and started planning the next attack. His squadron mates watched him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. One of them asked if he was crazy. Fleming did not answer. He just kept studying the map. June 5, 1942. Dawn had not yet broken when Fleming and a handful of other pilots climbed back into their aircraft. The Japanese fleet had been damaged the previous day. American carrier aircraft had sunk multiple carriers in a coordinated strike that would later be called the turning point of the Pacific War. But the battle was not over. One Japanese carrier, damaged but still afloat, was reported limping northwest, screened by escorts. Orders came down: finish it. This mission was different. The first strike had been chaos, dozens of aircraft converging from multiple directions, all trying to hit moving targets while under fire. This mission was surgical. A small group of dive bombers, escorted by whatever fighters could be spared, would go after the crippled carrier and attempt to send it to the bottom. The odds were still poor. The Japanese escorts would be on high alert. Their fighters would be desperate. But the target was vulnerable, and that made it worth the risk. Fleming was assigned to fly one of the Vindicators again. He checked the aircraft personally, walking around it, inspecting the control surfaces, the bomb shackles, the fuel lines. Everything had to be perfect. There was no room for mechanical failure. He briefed with the other pilots, reviewing the approach, the attack sequence, and the egress plan. Everyone knew the risks. No one backed out. They took off in the pre-dawn dark, climbing northwest over the same stretch of ocean they had crossed the day before. The formation was smaller now, tighter, more experienced. These were the survivors, the ones who had learned the lessons the hard way. Fleming flew in the second section, holding position, scanning the horizon. The sun rose behind them, casting long shadows across the water. The ocean was empty except for debris, patches of oil, floating wreckage, the remnants of yesterday's violence. Then ahead the ships appeared. The carrier was listing, smoke trailing from her flight deck. Destroyers circled like guard dogs, their guns trained skyward. The Americans climbed to attack altitude, splitting into sections. Fleming's group would go in second after the first wave drew the defensive fire. It was a calculated risk. The first wave would take the brunt of the flak. The second wave would have a clearer run, but also a more alert enemy. The first section rolled in. Black bursts filled the sky. Fleming watched, counting seconds, timing his approach. Then it was his turn. He nosed over, rolling into the dive, the Vindicator shaking as it accelerated. The carrier grew in his windscreen, her deck blackened and torn. He could see fires. He could see men moving. He could see the guns tracking him. The flak was lighter than the day before. Many of the escorts had expended their ammunition, but it was still lethal. One burst snapped past his wing, close enough to feel. He held the dive, the altimeter spun. The carrier filled his vision, and then at the release point he dropped his bomb. The Vindicator lurched. Fleming pulled back, hauling the stick into his gut, fighting the dive, clawing for altitude. The aircraft shuddered, groaned, and began to climb. Behind him the bomb fell. He did not see it hit, but moments later another explosion bloomed on the carrier's deck. Smoke poured skyward. Fleming turned east, heading for home. But as he leveled off, something felt wrong. The controls were sluggish. The engines sounded rough. He scanned the gauges, oil pressure dropping, coolant temperature rising. He had been hit. He did not know when or by what, but the Vindicator was dying. He called it in over the radio. Calm, matter of fact, engine damage, losing altitude. He gave his position and heading. Then he focused on flying. The ocean was a long way down and the aircraft was heavy. He throttled back, trying to conserve what little power he had left. He adjusted the trim, trying to stretch the glide. He did the math in his head. Distance to Midway, rate of descent, fuel remaining. The numbers did not add up. Other pilots called out to him, offering suggestions, offering hope. Fleming acknowledged them, but he knew he was not going to make it. The question was not whether he would ditch. The question was whether he could get close enough to be picked up. He kept flying. The engine coughed, sputtered, and seized. The propeller windmilled to a stop. The Vindicator became a glider, silent except for the rush of wind over the wings. Fleming trimmed for best glide speed and aimed for the horizon. He was still 50 miles from Midway. The ocean below was empty. He tightened his straps. He reviewed the ditching procedure. He kept the nose up, the wings level, and the airspeed just above stall. The water came up fast. He flared at the last second, pulling the nose up, trying to bleed off speed. The Vindicator hit the surface with a bone-jarring crash. The cockpit flooded instantly. Fleming unbuckled, kicked open the canopy, and hauled himself out. The aircraft sank within seconds. He inflated his life vest and floated alone in the middle of the Pacific. Hours passed. The sun climbed. The ocean was calm. Fleming floated, conserving energy, scanning the sky. He did not panic. He did not thrash. He simply waited. Late in the afternoon, a PBY Catalina appeared, circling low. The crew spotted him, descended, and landed on the water. They hauled him aboard, soaked and exhausted but alive. Fleming sat in the back of the Catalina, wrapped in a blanket, and did not say much. He had done his job. He had pressed the attack, and he had survived. Barely. But the story did not end there. What happened on June 5 was not widely known at the time. Fleming's aircraft had not been recovered. His bomb's impact was not immediately confirmed. And in the chaos of the battle, individual actions blurred into a collective effort. It was only later, when the full scope of the battle was analyzed, that the significance of Fleming's second mission became clear. His bomb, dropped from a dying aircraft during a near-suicidal attack run, had contributed to the destruction of a Japanese carrier that might otherwise have escaped. His decision to press the attack, even after being hit, had made a difference. Officially, Fleming survived the June 5 mission, but the war was not done with him. Weeks later, during the opening stages of the Guadalcanal campaign, he flew another strike mission, this time against Japanese cruisers bombarding Marine positions. Once again, he pressed his attack through heavy fire. Once again, he refused to break off. This time, he did not come back. His aircraft was seen diving toward a Japanese cruiser on fire out of control. He did not pull out. The official citation would later state that he deliberately crashed his aircraft into the enemy ship, a final act of defiance. Whether that was true, or whether he simply lost control, no one knows. But either way, Captain Richard Fleming died the way he had fought, focused, committed, and unwilling to quit. The immediate impact of Fleming's actions at Midway and Guadalcanal was tactical, not strategic. He did not invent a new technique. He did not develop a revolutionary weapon. What he did was demonstrate, through repeated action, that preparation and discipline could shift the odds in a pilot's favor. His meticulous study of enemy tactics, his careful planning of attack profiles, and his refusal to be rattled under fire all contributed to his effectiveness. And his example influenced those who flew with him. After Midway, surviving pilots from SB2U were debriefed extensively. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything: how the Japanese carriers had maneuvered, how their fighters had responded where the flak had been heaviest, what had worked and what had not. Fleming's notes, recovered from his gear, were passed up the chain. His observations on zero tactics were incorporated into training materials. His calculations on bomb release points were refined and distributed. His emphasis on staying disciplined during the dive became standard doctrine for Marine dive bomber squadrons. The broader tactical shift was already underway. Midway had proven that dive bombers, when properly coordinated and supported, could sink carriers. It had also proven that courage alone was not enough. The pilots who survived were the ones who stayed cool, who followed their training, and who did not allow the chaos to dictate their actions. Fleming had embodied that principle. And in the months that followed, as the Marines pushed up the Solomon Islands chain, that principle became the foundation of close air support and strike operations. Squadron commanders began to emphasize pre-mission planning in greater detail. Pilots were required to study target folders, memorize ship silhouettes, and rehearse attack profiles until they could execute them under stress. The culture shifted from individual heroics to collective precision. Fleming's legacy, though he was no longer alive to see it, was a professionalization of marine aviation that would pay dividends throughout the war. His posthumous Medal of Honor citation noted his courage, his skill, and his willingness to sacrifice himself for the mission. But those who knew him understood that his real contribution was subtler. He had shown that intelligence, preparation, and discipline were force multipliers. He had proven that the quiet, methodical pilot could be just as deadly as the aggressive ace. And he had done it without fanfare, without self-promotion, without any desire for recognition. He had simply done the job. By war's end, Marine dive bombers and close air support squadrons had flown thousands of missions across the Pacific. They supported amphibious landings at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They struck Japanese shipping, airfields, and fortifications with increasing accuracy and lethality. The tactics they used, the planning processes they followed, and the disciplined execution they demonstrated all traced their lineage back to men like Fleming, who had figured out how to survive and succeed in the worst conditions imaginable. The numbers tell part of the story. Marine Corps aviation losses decreased as the war progressed, not because the enemy became weaker, but because American pilots became more effective. Bomb accuracy improved. Mission success rates climbed. Aircrew survival rates increased. These were not accidents. They were the result of hard-won lessons, passed from one generation of pilots to the next, written in blood and filed in after-action reports. Fleming's name appeared in some of those reports. But his influence extended far beyond his own missions. Decades after the war, historians began to sift through the archives, reconstructing the battles, identifying the decisions and actions that had shaped the outcome. Fleming's story emerged slowly. He had not been a headline, he had not been an ace, he had not survived to write a memoir. But the records were there: flight logs, intelligence summaries, witness statements, and that worn notebook still preserved, filled with meticulous observations and careful calculations. What becomes clear looking back is that Fleming represented a particular kind of heroism. Not the loud, dramatic kind that gets celebrated in films, but the quiet, competent kind that actually wins wars. He was the pilot who did his homework, the officer who stayed calm, the man who saw the problem clearly and worked the solution without flinching. In a war defined by industrial scale and mass mobilization, he was a reminder that individual competence still mattered. His story also highlights a tension that ran through American military culture in the Second World War. On one hand, there was a deep respect for initiative, for boldness, for the aggressive pursuit of the enemy. On the other hand, there was a recognition that modern war required coordination, planning, and disciplined execution. Fleming embodied both. He was bold enough to volunteer for a second mission after surviving the first. But he was disciplined enough to study the problem, plan the solution, and execute it with precision. That combination was rare, and it was essential. The men who flew with him remembered him not as a warrior, but as a professional. One fellow pilot interviewed years later said that Fleming never talked about fear. He talked about fuel consumption, release altitudes, and firing angles. He treated combat like a complex engineering problem that could be solved with enough preparation. And in a way, he was right. War is chaos, but within that chaos, there are patterns. Fleming saw those patterns. He studied them. He used them. And he taught others to do the same. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously in 1942. His family received it at a quiet ceremony. His mother kept his uniform, his wings, and his notebook. She lived long enough to see the war end, to see the Marines come home, to see the world rebuild. She never spoke much about her son's death, but she kept his letters, and in them there is a glimpse of the man he was: thoughtful, determined, unshakable, and deeply aware that what he was doing mattered, not because it would make him famous, but because it would make a difference. Today, Richard Fleming's name is inscribed on memorials and in official histories. A destroyer escort was named after him. A scholarship fund was established in his honor. His story is taught at Marine Corps officer training, where new pilots learn about the importance of preparation, discipline, and commitment. But beyond the official recognition, his legacy lives in the culture he helped shape. A culture that values competence over bravado, preparation over improvisation, and quiet professionalism over loud heroics. War stories tend to focus on the dramatic moments, the last stands, the desperate charges, the impossible odds. But wars are not won in moments. They are won in the accumulation of small, disciplined actions, repeated over and over by people who understand what needs to be done and who do it without hesitation. Fleming understood that. He lived it. And in the end, he died doing it. The sky over Midway is clear now. The wreckage has long since rusted away. The men who fought there are nearly all gone, but the lesson remains. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear dictate your actions. Heroism is not about glory. It is about doing the hard thing, the right thing, when no one is watching and the outcome is uncertain. Richard Fleming never sought recognition, he sought results. And in a war where results were measured in ships sunk, missions completed, and lives saved, he delivered. They called him Bookworm. But in the end, his meticulous study, his quiet discipline, and his refusal to quit became the difference between chaos and victory.